Then when you had to separate all the fibers, and then they had a device that was actually nails driven up through a board or spikes. They call that a hackle. You ever heard people talk about a dog getting his hackles up? Well, they're referring to something to do with flax. And you would slap the fibers of flax through the hackle and pull it. And after so many different processes that you had to go through with, the flax was ready to spin, and essentially you would have to be real careful to separate the strands of flax. You had something called a distaff that would keep the fibers separate, and a good spinner was a woman that had a lot of spit, because you had to spit on the fiber to get it to stick together. After you spun it, you had to boil it to set the fiber, and then you had to throw it on a loom, a warp and a weft. Of course, flax was so expensive, so if you had any kind of pattern that you wanted to weave in it, you would interweave it with wool. So linsey woolsey became a big thing, but you know, if you just wanted something to wear against your skin, wool is not very comfortable against the skin. So any clothing would be linen, anything that touched your body. Here's the reason why our ancestors they didn't bathe very much at all. Some people were only bathed at birth and death. And in between, it was very, very rare to take a bath. Frederick the Great was only bathed twice in his lifetime. He was the Emperor of Prussia. And he was bathed when he was born, and he was bathed when he died. And they said his skin was the color of bronze. But our ancestors did not bathe. They might wash their face and hands and their feet, but that was about it. And soap was a rare commodity. If you were wealthy, you might be able to buy soap. But our ancestors knew how to make soap, and washing clothes was done in a stream of water. Clothes would be boiled if you were lucky enough to have a wash pot, and boiled with soap. But here's one of the strange things. If clothes had buttons on it, you had to take the buttons off every time you washed them. And then you have to sew them back on. So naturally, just having to do something like that, you just didn't want to have to do that very, very much. And with the ideas of hygiene, nobody washed their hands. You know, washing hands was not even common with doctors till way after the Civil War. They would examine a person that had died of a foul disease and then go without washing their hands and treat a person. By the way, that book that you're passing around is a Latin New Testament. It was printed in the 1500s during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. And I wanted you to notice the fact that the paper is still very supple in that, because that's very, very early paper. And I brought this just to show you, and I wish you could see this. You might look at this, but if you'll hold it up to the light, you'll see a pattern, and paper was actually lifted on these bronze frames or wire frames, and that is just stationary. That's, you know, if you were wealthy enough to buy paper, you would buy a book of paper sheets and just pat, you know, that would be what you would write on. And that's watermarked 1814. And the cover of that book is kid, which is young goat, or sometimes it was lamb, but it's white leather. And have you ever saved a newspaper for a few years till it got brittle? That's only because it's wood pulp paper. paper lasts forever if it's made out of cloth. This was printed in 1480. And this is very intact, very supple. You know, it's wonderful paper, and it's not, I mean, it'll be like this in 1,000 years if it's not damaged. But this was printed 30 years after Gutenberg invented the print press. Before that, it was manuscripts. And just to show you how well paper survives, this is a newspaper, a local, this was London, 1779. They didn't print big, giant papers. They did, but you could usually get these smaller copies a little bit cheaper. But this is very handleable paper. And you know, this is way over 200 years old. And if you took one of our newspapers today and kept it for 200 years, I doubt you could open it without it crumbling. In fact, paperback books and printed books from 1900 are falling apart now. And it's just kind of interesting. And I'm being real random with how I'm jumping around from time to place, but some of you doing research, have you ever wondered what an indenture is? What it says, this indenture? Here's a couple of documents that I've collected over the years. This is an indenture. See the top here? That's trimmed. Denture is from the Latin word teeth. So there's points on any document that was called an indenture. And they did away with this. Of course, you'll see documents much later than this. This is dated 1790, and this is signed, I think this was Burke County. And they talk about a peppercorn rent, which was just significant. This is another one, another indenture, but it was not. This was right after they quit cutting the paper. And this is Burke County, and it's signed by Pleasant Goodall, who was the father of Sebring Goodall. The Sebring Goodall house is still standing in Scriven County. And these other people that signed it, they're Moors. And Arthur Gross told me that they hid because they were Tories. And after they held the courts of confiscation after the Revolutionary War, the Moors had to leave their homes. And he said they hid in the swamp. He said skeeters ate them. I always enjoyed listening to Mr. Arthur. He was one of my great inspirations. Mr. Arthur was blind in one eye, and he had a 7th grade education, but he knew more about colonial Georgia than anybody I knew of. And he could just tell you anything, like how long it would take to get a boat up the Savannah River going upstream, how you found a road. The only way you knew you were on a public road was to see the blaze marks on trees on either side, because roads were not paved or marked or anything like that. And there were no such things as road maps. So you just stumbled blindly, and if you found a house, you'd always ask them, exactly where am I? This is another book that I was going to mention to y'all. I asked Lillian if this was in the library, and she wasn't sure. But this was one of the last books that Smith Banks recommended to me, Hog Meat and Hoe Cake, and it was written by a guy named Sam Bowers Hilliard. You can still get it through Amazon. You can even get it as a Kindle book. But this tells you everything about what people ate in the period from before the Civil War. What was our dietary habit? What foods were common then? And talking about a potato, they weren't talking about a white potato, they were talking about a sweet potato. And, you know, when you think about it, everything that they grew, they ate. Our ancestors did not know how to fertilize. That was learned much, much later, in the last half of the 1800s, they knew more about that. But you study land and how your ancestors moved. Our ancestors were bottom farmers. They only knew how to till land and bottom land. And one of the reasons why this part of Georgia was so populated, or why people wanted to come here, was the very peculiar thing that we have in this area called Carolina Bays. And most of you may be familiar with that because there's a huge concentration of them around the area of New England, Georgia. And they actually start, they think that whatever happened may have happened over Ohio. Some people say that it was a comet that broke up, and that's been somewhat refuted. But there's no evidence of meteors hitting the ground because they've never found one. But you have all these bays all over this area of Georgia and South Carolina, and they're ovoid in shape, and they all point the same direction. And sort of the southern end of most of the bays is a sandy berm where it kicked up the, whatever happened, kicked up the dirt. Now, some people say it was a natural formation from the ocean, but it's strange that some of these Carolina bays exist above the ancient coastline of the United States. So I don't think anybody's really described it real well. But our ancestors would drain these bays, and they would plant in the bays. And you think, oh, well, you can just go out there and plow with a mule or a horse. Our ancestors did not have mules. A horse would bog down in that kind of ground. But most of what they plowed with was oxen. George Washington was a big reason why mules were introduced in the United States. They were well known in Europe, but there were very, very few mules in colonial U.S. at that particular time. But everybody used oxen. In fact, most wagons were pulled by oxen. When they plowed with an iron shovel plow, and not the turn plows that you see, the traditional turn plow that has the curved blade that'll throw dirt over to the side. It looked like a shovel almost. And they put it on a wooden frame, and it just literally pushed the dirt out of the way. And you had to have something strong like an oxen to manage the soil after you drained it, because you just wouldn't be strong enough. A mule couldn't pull a shovel plow. I would be very doubtful that they could manage it because it was very, very hard to do. We have a bay on our place, and we know that the land originally belonged to Benjamin and Clement Lanier in the late 1700s, right after the Revolutionary War, and he drained that bay. And there's some evidence that there's still the remains of a dam and a sluice where he regulated the water. And we think that he may have planted rice in that area. And, we love rice in the South, but our ancestors planted rice everywhere. And in fact, the rice was such a high quality till the Chinese even imported it. And it reached royal tables. The nobles of China would eat rice, particularly from the Charleston area. Our ancestors knew how to regulate the flow of water. And you don't have to have water to grow rice, because they actually had an upland rice that didn't have to be in water. But one of the reasons why they flooded rice paddies was to keep the weeds down, because most plants can't survive in water. But the interesting thing about the pond, that the bay that's on our place, and it covers about 60 acres now. It was probably more like 50 then. Is the ditches that the Laniers dug in the 1790s are still, we know where they are. And in about 1930, my granddaddy decided that he wanted a cypress fence, a picket fence around the yard. And they knew that there were old cypresses down in the bottom of that pond because the pond had burned in the 1890s. The trees had caught fire, had dried up, and everything burned. So there's no real old trees there, but there were some down in the mud. Because I think all up and down the creeks and rivers here, you can find ancient trees in the mud. And my granddaddy hooked up teams of mules, and at that time he had a bunch of mules, and he drug some of those logs out. One of them had the dimensions of a ditch cut into it, which would have been done in the 1790s by the Laniers. And the log was so big till the notch for the ditch, the dimensions of the ditch were still in it. And they sawed that wood up and made a picket fence, and I still have part of that fence around my yard now because it was red heart cypress. But I always thought it was so interesting that they ditched that. And there were a lot of people that were brought into this area, particularly a lot of Irish immigrants, and they were ditchers. And in Scriven County, I don't know much about the bays in Bulloch County, but there's a pond in the northeastern part of Scriven called Mobley Pond. And it was 2 miles long and about a mile wide. And it was ditched. It was full of water when our ancestors came here. And anybody in this area that's a Neesmith, the ancestor, James Neesmith, lived at the edge of Mobley Pond. And he was a colonial magistrate for the English government then. But at some point, about 1840, an agricultural magazine talked about the miracle of the growth, the farming in Mobley Pond Basin. And it was only because they had ditched that place way back and had drained all the water out of it. Because you can imagine how much water a 2 mile by 1 mile ovoid must have held. But they got all of that water out of there. And you could farm a bottomland for about 10 to 15 years, and then you had to move on. So we get real amazed at seeing our ancestors with large tracts of land, but only about 10 to 20% of that land was even useful. They didn't farm upland in those days. If it wasn't boggy and if it wasn't full of peat or, marshy ground, it was useless. And it was only after the advent of crops like cotton that you started seeing people move into highland areas and farm in the upland area. And by the way, this county was kind of built on Sea Island cotton. But that cotton is extinct now. Nobody saved seeds from Sea Island cotton, and it went extinct sometimes after World War II. It was a black seed cotton. And you used to have cotton seed separators where you could filter out the very valuable black seed cotton. And strangely enough, the further south you go, the better cotton lives. You get down in the Caribbean, they call it ratooning. And the closest relative to cotton we have is something that we eat called okra. And okra and cotton are almost the same, that's the same immediate family. And down in the Caribbean, an okra plant never dies. It just falls over and keeps growing. Same thing with cotton. When Sea Island cotton was at its height, some of the plants would be 8 feet tall. And they would cut it off at the end of the year and let it grow back from the roots, and that's called ratooning. And you can do that with okra still, but the temperature is somewhat cooler now than it used to be, because I know all the planting zones exist in the United States. But there are pictures of cotton growing in the Caribbean, particularly the Sea Island cotton variety, and it's way taller than a man stood. Everybody had sheep in this area. Everybody raised sheep because you had to have wool. But there was an interesting plague that entered our country about the end of World War I called the sheep burr. And it came from South America. And suddenly sheep disappeared because once the wool was fouled with the sheep burr, it couldn't be used. And you just don't think about the fact that Scriven County and Bulloch County produced more wool than they did cotton in 1850. Everybody grew. They were huge. There were thousands of sheep. You see this stuff about cattle and the fact that there were huge cattle pens in the Carolinas and Georgia. That wasn't for meat. Nobody ate beef. Beef was rarely eaten. You killed a cow, what were you going to do with all that meat? How were you going to preserve it? Cows were killed and divided between people occasionally, but most of the cows were driven to the port cities like Charleston, sometimes even Savannah, thousands of cows, and they were killed. It was the leather that our ancestors wanted. The meat was packed in barrels with salt and sent to the Caribbean to feed enslaved people that were working in molasses and sugarcane down there. But our ancestors wouldn't have eaten it. And occasionally you would kill a cow and would divide it up. And our ancestors did not eat sheep, by the way. They ate pork because they had a way to preserve pork with salt and smoking and so forth, but you can't do that with beef. And our ancestors had all kind of fowl in the yard. You had chickens, and the sad thing is in the 1700s, our ancestors called them dunghill chickens, because chickens lived off of the corn that passed through the gullets of cows and horses. And most of the cows that you had on your place, you might have kept a cow and had an oxen that you raised. But, the few cows that you had were just for the milk. And our ancestors didn't drink milk either, for the most part. So many people were lactose intolerant, but they made cheese. And they made clabber, which was something sort of like yogurt that we eat now. But chicken was a ready source of meat. You didn't have eggs year-round. Chickens would quit laying in the winter. So if you had eggs through the cold months, you had to put the eggs in a brine solution and literally keep them, hoping that they wouldn't rot in that brine. And people actually put fish up that way by storing them in brine. Our ancestors didn't know how to can. They didn't have the sealed jars that we have now. So they grew greens year-round. You would bank sweet potatoes. You'd pile them up with straw and a layer of dirt and sweet potatoes, straw, dirt. And you'd put wood slabs on the teepee-like structures to keep the sweet potatoes from rotting during the years when you had them stored. The further north you go, you could actually bank cabbage that way. Our ancestors dried apples. I never have heard of them drying pears, but I know that pears were available, and they would eat pears when they were in season. One of the few things that they did grow that we don't even pay any attention to now is a fruit called quince. And quince was eaten very, very much, and it's a pear-like fruit that grows. Most quince bushes are bush-like, they're only about this tall, but the fruit would be pretty large, and they would actually make a preserve. It was short-lived, but they would eat that. And there were a lot of things. They grew every kind of peas and beans in those days. And when you got to the fall, the late season, you'd leave the last ones on the bush and you'd let them dry. And then you'd pick all those and put them in sacks and beat the sack full of peas, and it would knock the peas out. And so you'd have all the hulls, but in the bottom of the sack, you'd have just a quantity of dried peas or beans. And you would pour those into crocks, or if you were lucky enough to have jars or something like that. And that would be one of the few things that you could subsist on. Bread, wheat was not grown in the deep south very, very much. It was very, very rare. And if you got it, you would usually have to buy it. So most of our ancestors, now in North Georgia, they did have wheat. But down in this part, it was cornmeal and nothing. And our ancestors just about lived on cornbread. I was so surprised. My great-grandmother was living when I was a child. She was born in 1881, and she said they always made gingerbread with cornmeal.